Hi everybody, long time no see. It's your favorite YouTuber, Evelyn, or I Am Error here, and I thought it's time we should do an unboxing review, but I don't have any boxes, so I got this bag. It's a bag of personal belongings, and in the bag is the things that they gave me when I was discharged from the hospital. So let's see all the things they gave me. All right, well, and here, these are my unmentionables. So we're not gonna show you those ones, okay? Let's see, what else do we got in here? Oh, ooh, look at this. It's one of my t-shirts. It's my Cowboy Bebop t-shirt with Einstein, the dog from that show. You can't see him though, because they cut the shirt off of me when I was in the ambulance and don't remember anything. Oh, let's see what else is in here. Ooh, it's my bra. Also cut in half. Let's see what else. Oh, I was wearing shorts. Cut in half. I guess I'm probably never wearing these again. Oh well. Let's see. There should be some socks, I think. Oh yes, some socks. Look, a sock there. Not cut in half. They just pulled this one off of me. Oh, what's this? Oh, the last thing in here. It's my purse. Oh, look at that. I can use my purse. It's still got my stuff in it. Woohoo. Oh, what's this? Oh my God, that's my blood. Anyway, this is a video about Shadow of the Colossus. When somebody turns on a PlayStation 2 with a copy of the 2005 game Shadow of the Colossus spinning in their console approximately 500 times a minute, they are greeted with a flying hawk descending upon a valley until it crosses the path of a wanderer, who, incidentally, is named Wander. Wander rides a horse, and together they carry a corpse to parts unknown. They move through cliffs, forests, and forgotten lands until they reach cracked architecture and a long, out-of-place bridge illuminated by the brightest sun you'll ever see. At this point, Shadow of the Colossus displays its title and beckons us to start pressing buttons on our controller to begin our journey. The information present in this pre-menu select animation is not repeated when one selects New Game, but it does importantly set up what kind of game this is and how we should feel about it. Shadow of the Colossus is a game about and for someone who's traveled far. Not only has Wander traveled a great physical distance to reach this temple, but the corpse he carries is evidence of time's cruel passing. Someone once alive is now dead. We can infer, just from a 1-minute cutscene, that Wander crosses fields, valleys, and forests, untold geographic miles, for a chance to uncross time's arrow. Perhaps we should have already known how that would end before we started playing, huh? Wander's journey mirrors our own, because we too can't help but get further away from things, whether geographically or temporally. We're always moving, and yet we can't help but attempt to claw our way back to what once was, and like Wander, fail in the attempt. Shadow of the Colossus released in North America, where I was living at the time, on October 18th, 2005. In it, we play as a scrawny lover boy so obsessed with bringing a loved one back from the dead that he is willing to kill walking skyscrapers to make it happen. How this game got released in the United States in the Bush era is beyond me. Inspired by the idea of a game with only boss fights, I picked it up near release day, and it soon became one of my favorite games of all time. A year later, my family lost our home, and in the shuffle of packing things for storage, I lost my PlayStation 2 and all my games, and I haven't played Shadow of the Colossus since. That is, until July 2023, as a little gift to myself for completing my dissertation. But mostly because I wanted to make a video for you all about the best game I ever played when I was 15 years old. That's right, folks, the Nintendo 64 era is over. We talked about the best games I ever played when I was 5 and when I was 10, but the time won't stop, and neither will I. Let's talk about 2005. Well, in part 2. You see, before any self-respecting games critic can make a multi-hour video on Shadow of the Colossus, they've got to do their homework and play Eco, a game made by basically the same people. Unfortunately, because Eco is, well, Eco, we're going to have to pull up our pants, put on our thigh-high boots, and wade into the "Are video games art?" discourse, because Eco, evidently, is the preeminent example that will finally shut Roger Ebert and his whole crowd up about it. Outside of that, I'll give you the headline right away. Eco is a game about holding hands, and I like it more than Shadow of the Colossus, which surprised me. But that's like saying I like one of my cats more than the other, which I don't. So who's to say how I'll feel by the end of this review? In part 3, it's time to ask an important question. What the heck is Shadow of the Colossus even about? Don't go asking the internet, because you'll get a dozen answers for every half dozen commenters. Don't go asking Fumito Ueda, the game's creator, because he's not a big fan of video game stories in the first place, and would rather you figured it out for yourself. Don't worry though, I'll give you an answer. Will it be a good answer? I don't know. You tell me when you've watched that part. Finally, we've got one last surprise. Or rather, I almost got my last surprise a month ago, right after I finished beating Shadow of the Colossus for the second time, when a car ran into me and sent me to the hospital for nearly a week. I'm still recovering from that debacle. Still, my near-death experience has enlightened me. I've seen the cosmos, and I have wisdom to impart. So we'll round out this obnoxiously long review of Shadow of the Colossus by talking about death, the exact thing Wander's trying to avert in his God-inspired giant killing quest. Before we get on to Eco though, it's time to talk about something other than video games and traumatic life experiences. Money. Do you like these elaborate reviews? Do you like neurotic trans girls with minuscule internet followings? Perhaps you just feel guilty about siphoning your mom's Netflix subscription for the past 8 years, and it's time to give back by giving that money to somebody else. Me. In any case, you should support the I Am Error YouTube channel on Patreon. You'll get your name in these videos. I'll talk to you on Discord and tell you how much I dislike Starfield and how much I do like Armored Core. And patrons sometimes get other perks when I'm not halfway between life and death on a hospital bed. Thank you, thank you, thank you to all of my patrons, especially those of you who swooped in to help make this video possible with your financial support so I could hire an editor to help make this video. I love you all so much. Now, let's hold hands. Eco released for the PlayStation 2 in North America with terrible box art on September 25th, 2001, 2 weeks after a dreadful terrorist attack which would inspire a movie which would reference Shadow of the Colossus. Don't worry, we'll talk about that movie in part 3. Eco later released with good box art in Japan on December 6th and Europe in March of the next year. Eco was a critical success, a cult hit, and one of the greatest video games of all time. Well, if you don't look at the sales numbers, because it bombed in North America. Maybe it was the box art. Maybe it was the lack of guns. Maybe it was because it was art. What interests me about Eco, and what we'll talk about in this section, is the idea that it, and by extension its sibling, Shadow of the Colossus, is a preeminent example of video games as art. Now, if you followed this channel at all, you already know video games are art, and I don't feel any need to convince you of that, Roger. If you don't believe it, you have a pretty misinformed view on what art is in the first place, and I'm not going to waste much of my time on you. Yet, I find the fact that these two games serve as video games as artsy flag bearers to be oddly interesting. Why are Eco and Shadow of the Colossus, relatively unknown cult games with passionate fan bases but little wide appeal, the first examples cultural critics reach for when trying to prove the idea that video games are art? The pair, even outside the art discussion, are inextricably linked. I mean, sure, they're both made by Team Ico. Shadow of the Colossus could be construed as a prequel to Ico, and has been described as a spiritual sequel to its older sibling, which is already enough evidence. But heck, most people played these two games in a combo package when they released together for the PlayStation 3 in 2011 as the Ico and Shadow of the Colossus collection. Is it really a collection if it only has 2 exhibits? Simply put, we cannot talk about Shadow of the Colossus, the best game I ever played when I was 15 years old, without talking about Ico, a game which released when I was 10. Ico is as much the tails side of this coin as Shadow of the Colossus is the heads side of it. And my own personal experience of these two games has 2 sides too. Though it was not an important game to me back in those days because, well, I never owned it. You see, I was a Nintendo girl, and my first home console was a Nintendo GameCube. So the games I vibed with around the time of Ico's release were Super Smash Bros. Melee, Pikmin, and Animal Crossing. Then, to make matters worse, I got an Xbox before I got a PlayStation 2. So my next round of great games were Halo, Halo 2, Fable, Splinter Cell Chaos Theory, and Jade Empire. Maybe, for just a little bit of time, Halo 2 was the best game I ever played, but that's mostly because of Xbox Live. Then I played World of Warcraft, and that instantly usurped Halo. Any and all PlayStation games existed outside my periphery. I completely missed the boat on the best console of that generation. I didn't get a PlayStation 2 until 2005, and I had already exhausted the libraries of its competition before that. So why did I even get a PS2, you ask? Well, perhaps to play Ico and Shadow of the Colossus? No. I wanted to play 2 unrelated games that start with the same letter, Kingdom Hearts 2 and Katamari Damacy. Still, before I ever had a PlayStation 2 or Xbox, before Katamari Damacy or Kingdom Hearts were a glimmer in their creators' eyes, before Shadow of the Colossus or Resident Evil 4 or Halo or World of Warcraft, I got a chance to play the artsiest video game ever made. Not in my own living room, nor in some friend's house, nor at an art gallery, but in the least artistic place imaginable, a display television and console at my local Walmart in 2001. Sometime in those weeks, after some hijackers irrevocably changed world history, I was 1,090 miles away, stuck in my otherwise unperturbed rural hometown on a brisk weekday evening with a mom who was buying some supplies. I killed the time the usual way. I walked to the back of the store and either looked at video games or, if I was lucky, played them. At the time, the Xbox and GameCube were yet to be released, so my local Walmart served a buffet of 3 display consoles for customers to partake in. A Nintendo 64, which usually had Super Mario 64 or Super Smash Bros., a Dreamcast, which either had Sonic Adventure or NFL 2K1, and a PlayStation 2, which was bound to have some sports game with 2 controllers, either Madden, NHL, or Ridge Racer if we were lucky. This weeknight, though, something else beckoned to me. A boy with horns, a shiny girl in white, a lack of language or menu, an emphasis on pure vibes. With no one else in the electronics department, I placed my hands on a PlayStation 2 controller and tried to figure out a strange game called Ico. Unfortunately, I had no idea what was going on. The previous player had left me high and dry an hour into the game, and I was stuck in an endless loop where shadow creatures would steal the girl, result in a game over, and send me back to fight those shadow creatures again. To be honest, I thought it was like the stupidest game I'd ever played. Years of Ocarina of Time practice didn't make me any better at 3-dimensional combat. After a few attempts to protect Yorda and failing every time, an employee, likely a high school student, came and stood behind me to watch. I could feel sweat on my hands and pooling in my armpits. I didn't want to embarrass myself in front of someone else, as I still thought having video game skills was important back in 2001, and as a result, I always hated it when people watched me play games. As one of the shadows abducted my would-be girlfriend and threw her in a black hole, I threw my hands up in frustration. The employee replied, "You can hold her hand with the R button to pull her out." In a panicked stupor, I grabbed the controller and ran to the hole and pulled Yorda and myself out of despair and defeated the shadow creatures. Eventually, it probably took me a long time. I barely made any progress in the game, but I remember one thing clearly. My right hand clenched around the controller, not as though I was holding a piece of plastic, but as though I was holding someone else's hand for dear life. The employee got back to work. I got stuck on a puzzle, and soon my mom picked me up to go home. I didn't even learn the name of the game that evening. It wouldn't be until the next time I was at Walmart, disappointed to see Madden back in action as the display game of choice, that I scanned the store shelves until I saw what I now know is an awful cover and recognized it as the game I played a week or two prior. Ico left quite an impression on me, but its impression was limited to that one game where you can hold someone's hand. Also, that impression left me saying Ico in my head for 15 years, so please forgive me. For about 2 decades, I was Marge from The Simpsons. I just thought it was neat that you could do that in a video game, but I didn't get a PlayStation 2 until half a decade later, and by that point, Ico was an old game, not even available at most stores. I probably barely remembered it. I never got it, and I didn't play it again until July 2023 to prepare for this review. Yet, despite the Ico-sized hole in my life up until that point, I can't help but feel like it was a foundational game for me, purely by the fact that it expanded what I thought video games were capable of. It was a game where you held someone's hand, where you controlled 2 characters at once, where you didn't have a health bar, where how the game made you feel moment to moment was more important than what you did in those moments. Compared to Super Mario 64 or Ocarina of Time, some of the other best games I'd ever played, Ico was so much looser and free in its expression. I liked those Nintendo 64 exclusives more, but Ico was something else, something different. Though I also know I'm looking back on it with rose-colored glasses. Ico was never going to be the best game I ever played when I was 10 or even 15. It's only one of the best games I've ever played now because the current me played it this year and can appreciate it for what it is. And that's why I'm stuck on the question of Ico's artistry. Ico is no more art than Ocarina of Time or, Twisted Metal. And yet, we've collectively decided Ico is more art than most other video games. Patrick Johnson voiced incredible disappointment that Roger Ebert, video games' artistic nemesis, quote, never got to play Ico because it evidently would have convinced him to drop his game-hating crusade. Tom Hoggins called Ico and Shadow of the Colossus 2 strikingly beautiful masterpieces in a 2008 New York Times article where he argued gamers are artists at heart, once again in defiance of Roger Ebert. Charles Harold, in a 2001 New York Times Reviewer's Choice article, called Ico a compelling work of art. Andre Alupulue, writing his review for GameSpy, said Ico looks like a piece of fine art. Chris Sullentrop, writing for The New Yorker, said Ico and Shadow of the Colossus perfectly accomplished Roger Ebert's point of art, which was to, quote, make ourselves more cultured, civilized, and empathetic. Heck, even when Ebert finally said he made a fool of himself for picking a fight with the video game world, he included a bunch of pictures of Shadow of the Colossus in the article. Or at least his editor did. I don't know if he had any clue what Shadow of the Colossus was. You can find endless examples of people citing specifically these 2 games to win the argument that games are art. Why is that though? In the last elaborate review, I made the claim that Ocarina of Time is the mayonnaise of video games because it is the most video gamey video game. If that's the case, Ico and Shadow of the Colossus are anti-mayonnaise. I don't know what that would be for a food metaphor, because they're the least video gamey video games. By that, I mean they conform as little as possible to the video gamey things video games do that suggest they're merely games and not aspirational to capital A art. To take a simple example, let's consider numbers. Numbers are a seemingly ever visible part of video games. I mean, heck, you could say video games are numbers at the end of the day, just a series of ones and O's. Though that's incredibly reductionist, and if that bothers you, don't think too hard about your favorite Netflix shows or YouTube videos, because they're all ones and O's too. If you look at most early examples, games display numbers on the screen as you play. Pong's got a score right there. Pac-Man contains quite a few. Your current score, the machine's high score, and the number of lives you've got stocked up. The original Super Mario Bros. Has your score, your current number of coins, what world you're on, and how much time you have left to complete the level. Moreover, if you jump on a Goomba or Koopa, kapow! A number appears for a flickering second to denote you won some points. I'm sure someone out there could dedicate an entire book to all the different ways numbers intersect with the games we play. Maybe I should have written that instead of a book on games and time. But don't numbers intrinsically pull us out of the artistic experience? Let's say you're reading a book. If you stopped every time you turned a page to cease reading and verbalize, I'm on page 162 now, you'd be pulling yourself out of the story. If you were watching a movie in the theater and the projectionist paused the entire thing every time they needed to swap reels, you'd realize pretty quickly the artifice of the artistic experience. If you were watching a play and every time an actor came on the stage, they announced, I am playing Othello in this scene, your suspension of disbelief would be broken. Most artistic mediums attempt to convey a sense of transparency between audience and art. They don't want you to think about the metaphorical frame of the picture. They want you to dwell on its content. Paratext is bad in this sense, at least for the artistic sensibility, which evidently yearns to get lost in a work of art, to lose sight of the frame, as it were. Video games, whether by their strict adherence to numbers, their plethora of menus and adjustable settings, and the high incidental factor of game over screens, or the heady and complicated interface between user and game, aka the controller, are simply rife with immersive yoinking potential, and for most of the early years of the medium, the yoinking was the point. It's what made games fun, interesting, and unique. It's what drew our attention to them in the first place. Eco and Shadow of the Colossus seemingly refute the not art claim in a rather lackadaisical manner. They do not draw attention to the metaphorical page numbers. Eco has no numbers on the screen. It doesn't even have any representation of numbers, no health bars, and basically no text. Eco makes any sense of an underlying ludic system invisible and pleads with you not to look under the hood, to just experience the events of the game firsthand. Shadow of the Colossus, meanwhile, does have some health and stamina bars, but similarly has little dialogue or instruction and no numbers. In essence, we could say that a score in Pac-Man holds your hand and that it directs you toward a goal. Meanwhile, in Eco and Shadow of the Colossus, you hold the game's hand. Sometimes literally, and it appears to let you direct it on where to go. For this reason, we claim it's art, because it's the not like other girls of games. Eco and Shadow of the Colossus, of course, have other features in their games as art favor, like their terrific art style, the whole auteur theory nature of their creator Fumito Ueda, and their non-verbal storytelling. But none of those are particularly unique to them. Don't Shigeru Miyamoto and Hideo Kojima's games cover the same ground? Doesn't Pac-Man have terrific art and auteur behind it and nonverbal storytelling? We seem to run into an issue where no one wants to define what art is in the first place. So 90% of the arguments people come up with to prove X or Y game is art ring hollow because nobody has any idea what they're trying to prove in the first place. The examples we wrangle to prove games are art are meaningless. It's just an attempt to find games that aren't like other games. And in the process, you sell the farm and insinuate that all those other games aren't art. If you can't defend Pac-Man or Pong's artistic merits, you've already lost to Roger Ebert. So I'd like to suggest a new reason games struggle to reach the moniker of art. They do a poor job of communicating another person's lived experience. You see, we seem to think art is when we experience someone else's experience. Remember, Ebert said the goal of art was essentially empathy. You read, I don't know, a Cormac McCarthy novel, and wowee, you see the world through new eyes. That's art. You view the Mona Lisa and see a woman through the eyes of a horny 15th century Italian. That's art. You watch You've Got Mail, and bam, you suddenly know what it's like to be in an anonymous online relationship. That's art. It appears, most prevalent to me at least, that great works of art are supposed to offer us another person's viewpoint so tangibly as to feel real and important to us, to give us a connection both to the author and to all other people who experienced the piece of art, to build some sense of culture. Meanwhile, video games give us our own experiences, and thus we don't inherently think of them as art. Think about it. When you play Doom, you aren't seeing the world through John Romero's eyes. You're seeing John Romero's world through your eyes. That's a profound difference. You add something to the equation, something important and essential. But the moment you do, you rip and tear something idiots seem to assume is nascent in all art, another perspective. People who talk about art so desperately want to act like they don't exist at all, like real art has the ability to just wash over you and minimize your subjectivity. That's wrong. You're always you experiencing something, whether it's Persona, the Sistine Chapel, or Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Maybe great art materializes us elsewhere, gives us the illusion that we're not there for a moment, but it's a lie. You're there. You've always been there. You'll always be there. Art does not and cannot exist outside of subjective experience. If it is not viewed, played, or heard, it might as well not exist. Though, note, the moment you paint a picture, you viewed it. The moment you write a song, you've heard it. So don't take this to mean art requires an external audience. An artist is always their own first audience, just as I was the first audience of this artistic essay you're viewing now, though maybe my editor has some other feelings about that. Suffice to say, art is all around us. You experience it all the time. When someone puts their 5 favorite works on a pedestal and says, well, that's the real art, we should immediately discredit them as the fools they are. Video games are art because they're modes of communication where the how, what, and why all matter, and that's what counts. You are maybe wondering why I'd bother to talk on this subject at all, and you'd be right to wonder. It's stupid to argue with idiots, but I think it matters to set the record straight, because as long as people keep arguing over if games are art, we're never going to get to talk about Eco and Shadow of the Colossus. They'll always be overshadowed by the are games art debate, because they're evidently the best examples we've got that, yes, games are art, according to some. In one of Ebert's moronic articles on the topic, he criticized games likers for caring about games as art, asking, why are gamers so intensely concerned anyways that games be defined as art? And the reason is that you and people of your ilk are even more intensely concerned with denying an entire art form. I don't need any of your validation, Ebert, rest in peace, or that of your terrible company, but if you're going to, with no knowledge of the art form, keep sticking your opinions where they don't belong, you force us to have the conversation. But the thing is, I want to talk about Eco. Can I talk to you about Eco, please? Because in my research for this video, I finally played it for real and I learned a critical truth. It's great, probably better than Shadow of the Colossus, even though you people don't seem to agree, according to a poll from my YouTube channel. I like Eco more than 99% of the games, and you should too. Eco isn't more art than, I don't know, E.T., which is coincidentally the greatest game ever made, but it's worth the fuss. So I'm gonna fuss over it. Okay, so for those not in the know, Eco is a game where you play as two characters trying to escape a fortress controlled by an evil witch queen. One of the characters you control is Eco, a boy with horns sent to the fortress as a sacrifice. The second of these characters is Yorda, the witch queen's daughter. To escape the castle, the two of you need to figure out how to open the front gate so you can waltz out of there a free pair. Eco doesn't try to do or be more than this simple premise, and that's why it's perfect. You may be confused by my description. The game is called Eco. Don't you play as one character, the titular one? The answer is no. Part of what makes Eco different than other games is that you embody multiple characters at once, or in essence, you act as both them and their relationship with each other. Most video games only give you one perspective. In Pac-Man, you are Pac-Man and nobody else. The same is true for Mario and Super Mario Bros., Link and The Legend of Zelda, Sonic and Sonic the Hedgehog, Metroid and Metroid Prime, and Gex in Gex. One of the most popular genres in games is called the first-person shooter, which quite obviously gives you one perspective, that of the person whose eyes you are looking through. Even in games with multiple controllable characters like simulation games or real-time strategy games, we usually embody some other character. For instance, your Sims house could be home to a variety of characters, but you are not them. They are your dolls, and you are God. Similarly, in StarCraft, despite your dreams, you are not a Zergling, and you never will be. You're the commander of these forces, and you tell everybody else what to do. You may make an emotional connection to these characters you direct, but your existence supersedes theirs. They can die. You cannot. I'm not criticizing other games here. It's okay for them to situate us within the perspective of others, but it's the fact that Eco refuses to do so that makes it so beautiful. In Eco, there is no yourself you play as. You play as an ourself. On one hand, you are Eco, the boy with the horns, a protector with a precious and puzzle-solving nature. On the other hand, you are Yorda, the girl with light powers, the protected member of the pair with her own puzzle-solving abilities. Most of the buttons on the PlayStation 2 controller seem to mess with only Eco. The D-pad and analog stick move him around. The face buttons let him jump, attack, and interact with objects. Yorda, meanwhile, has only one button dedicated to her, R1, and it actually controls the pair. When you press R1, if Yorda is far away, Eco calls to her and she moves to him. Believe it or not, that's actually you controlling Yorda in the moment. When she is close to Eco and you press R1, she holds his hand. When that happens, you control both of them, though Eco leads Yorda around for the most part. The duality of the pair's relationship is the entirety of what Eco is about. When you clench the R1 button, these two characters survive together. When a shadow creature grabs one or knocks out the other, the stress is palpable. At once you find yourself desperate to save yourself and desperate to save a kind of someone else. I'd be curious to learn who most players identify with as they play the game. I personally felt like I embodied Yorda more than I did Eco. Obviously the gendered component helped, but I think it also had to do with the fact that Eco has young boy energy and Yorda felt like the older of the pair. Looking at Eco, I felt worried about him. I thought, who's gonna watch after this little guy? And when Yorda popped up, I thought, that's me, the guardian of this little guardian. Over the course of the game, you learn to care for these characters and ourselves, who is both the player and always something more than the player. Don't for one second think Eco is a game where you just control a boy. You're both the boy and the girl, and as a result, the game fulfills its games as our art promise without much more effort, as experiencing it forces you to step outside yourself and see the world from another vantage point. Eco is a deeply emotional experience, but for the most part, the emotions come from yourself, not the game. It's one thing when a game has some sad, mad, or happy thing happen on the screen. Boo-hoo, Master Chief lost Cortana, or oh boy, I sure am angry that Elon Musk from Doom betrayed us again, or oh yes, kiss me Asterion softly, or bite hard, whatever you prefer, my love. In most of these instances, the games force us into cutscenes or dialogues to goad an emotional reaction, but not in Eco. In Eco, the emotions come from your experience of the game, because the moment a shadow creature grabs Yorda, you experience panic. It's you who just got grabbed, and it's only you who can save yourself. The game's puzzles are kind of simple, but no children or fairies are going to help you out. The moment you solve them, the joy of progress is truly experienced by you. In that sense, while it's not a video game, Eco is a video game in the sense that it refuses to be anything else. It's not a movie, it's not a book, it's not a TV show, it's a game. One with something important to say, and that unabashed nature is a big reason why it's lauded as art in the first place. The issue is that Eco is perfect. I mean that as a compliment, but right now it's a problem. Eco can't be our example of games as art because it sets the bar too high. It's so emotionally evocative and powerful that it just leaves everything else in the dust. Suffice to say, you can still be art if you don't reach Eco's lofty goals. Let's consider one moment from the 2/3 mark of the game, the most pivotal moment in the entire plot, actually. Here, Eco and Yorda have done it. They've activated these 2 satellite dishes of light, pointed them in the right direction, and now the gate's open. And more importantly, the bridge is connected. The fortress is sea-locked no more. Together, they can escape. The pair make their way to the bridge and begin to cross it, but halfway through they're sabotaged by the Witch Queen, who shocks Yorda with wanton electricity and separates the pair. Yorda falls over, fatigued and undone by the jolt, while the bridge, like the companions, splits apart. Eco is on the side returning to the mainland. In essence, he is saved. But the player takes control, and we know we're not saved because we're both Yorda and Eco. We tell Eco to leap across the widening gap between bridge pieces. The distance is too far though. He can't make it. But in a sudden reversal of roles, Yorda grabs our hand, saving us from the deadly fall. Yorda's grasp of Eco's hand is the most pivotal moment in the entire game. It represents a shift from the player potentially viewing themselves as Eco saving her, and argues they're also Yorda saving him. While the moment is left out of control of the player, the dynamic of their relationship is irrevocably asserted to be symbiotic and mutual, not one-sided. The central verb of the game, to hold someone's hand, is definitively a collaborative one. It requires 2 people to take action at the same time. To hold someone's hand is to connect with them and become one, if only for a short time. Eco is a video game and no other medium because it selects one verb from many and commits its entire existence around exploring that verb, which comes to full fruition the moment it's not us telling the companions to hold hands anymore, where they do it because we've taught them to do it without thinking. I find that beautiful. I wish more games would center themselves around such a simple verb, particularly the powerful ones like holding someone's hand. The first time I held my wife's hand was on November 11th, 2011. At the time, she was going to college in Sarasota, Florida, while I was doing so in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. We met in neither place that summer, but rather Beijing, China. It's a long story, I'm not going to get into it. In September of that year, she went on a camping trip with me and some of our mutual friends. I picked her up from the airport, and the trip was only possible because she got a last-second standby seat. While we were camping, I told her I liked her, and she said she liked me back, starting our lifelong relationship. 2 months later, after a painful period of separation and longing, I took my own standby flight from Milwaukee to Sarasota. I only afforded the trip by selling my plasma to a giant pharmaceutical company, and the fact that standby flights were only $100, but every ounce of blood they took was worth it. Also, if you look closely, you can actually see the needle mark from all the plasma I gave. That first night, we went down to the bay and sat by the ocean. It was the first time I'd seen the ocean in quite a few years. There, I made my move, and I put my hand in hers. I don't think I've ever been happier, or at least more excited, than I was sitting by that night's ocean. While I had talked to her every day for months, nothing could replace physically being there, physically touching her hand with mine, physically breathing the same air. My heart leapt through my chest, and that moment in Sarasota will always be one of the highlights of my life. Every time I hold my wife's hand, I feel an echo of emotion reverberating out from over a decade ago. Today, I have a child, and like most parents, I hold my child's hand often. I hold their hand when we walk down the stairs out of our apartment. I hold their hand when I guide them to whatever necessary activity is next. I hold their hand when they're crying and need comfort. I hold their hand when we're by the water of Lake Michigan because they're scared of the water and need a little bit of guidance. When I was a child, I held my mom and dad's hand. When you were a child, you probably held your parents' hand too. While Iko and Yorda are not a parent-child relationship, when we clench our fists to bring them together, we reenact every time we've ever held someone else's hand, whether as the recipient of help, the giver of it, a romantic partner, a child, or a parent. And isn't that beautiful? When I play Iko, I feel like I did by the ocean. When I hold R1, I feel like I'm holding my wife or child's hand. When Yorda, unprompted, reaches out her hand to save Iko, I feel my heart swell with emotion. It's not just me feeling these sentiments, it's them too. This sweet moment, though, is short-lived. As Yorda holds Iko off the bridge, the Witch Queen reveals herself, corrupts Yorda, turning her bloomy white skin into shadows. Yorda's strength fades. She drops Iko into the abyss below, and the game fades to black. It rests on black for what feels like forever, with only the harsh sounds of rushing water to comfort the player. Then it cuts to Iko, who survived the fall on some kind of strange hanging platforms, a necessary trite plot device. They kind of look like cages. I have no clue what they're supposed to be. After a moment, we take control again, destined to climb back into the fortress. I'll be honest, if Iko's art to all those critics, maybe it's the previous cutscene and this moment that sells it the hardest. As I told Iko to leap from platform to platform, emotion swept over me. Not melancholy or sadness, well, those were there, but loneliness. Without Yorda, I felt incomplete, hollow, empty. At this point, I'd spent 6 hours holding her and Iko's hand, and now I could hold neither's. I think the profound emotion of this moment, the dreadful feeling of loss which permeates the last chapter of the game, makes Iko memorable and important. The game gives us ability to sit on a bay, feel butterflies in our stomach as we hold someone else's hand, and then with tremendous force, rips you asunder. I can't even say I felt motivated to go back into the fortress. Without Yorda, I couldn't do anything, but I had to. Like a zombie, I shambled forward, knowing that I would be a zombie for the rest of my life if I couldn't get Iko and Yorda back together. The entire tenor of the game changed. Each puzzle, which previously had been an intriguing if mostly trivial mental challenge, served only to annoy and pester me. Without a companion with which to aid Iko, the gameplay felt dour and unimportant. Who cared if I made that jump? What did it matter if I was smart enough to figure out some trick to progress in the story? Fortunately, the game understood that position, and I spent less than 30 minutes traversing the fortress alone. In short order, I fought the Witch Queen, denied her from Yorda's body, and brought the entire fortress crashing down. It's worth noting that in this moment, the pair's roles are reversed again, because it's Yorda who picks up the weakened Iko, gets him on a boat, and kicks him out of the place before it all comes crashing down. Then there, in the game's final moments, Iko finds himself in a familiar place to us, a beach. He wakes up after his terrible, God-killing deed, and together we look past the sand and water or the freedom of escape, and we see a figure washed ashore. We go out to them and stretch out our hand, and we accept, ready to extend ourselves beyond the sea, beyond the horizon, beyond the shadows which haunt us. A month ago, I woke up at 3:32 a.m. in a place I didn't recognize. It was a hospital. I didn't know what day of the week it was. I didn't know what happened to me. I scrambled my surroundings and found my phone. I sent a message to the woman whose hand I held in a Sarasota Bay a decade ago. I told her I loved her, and I asked, did I get staples in my head? 5 hours later, she was back for her third day by my side. Not too long after, I held her hand and cried. To hold someone's hand is to be alive, and for them to be alive too. It's to be together. And as a human being, I can't survive without it. I'm not sure anyone can. Shadow of the Colossus is the best game I ever played when I was 15 years old. It released on October 18th, 2005, 5 days before I turned 14 years old. So, like Ocarina of Time, which I really first played when I was 8, but was the best game I ever played when I was 10, and Super Mario 64, which was the best game I ever played when I was 6, but came out when I was 5, I had a little bit of lead up in hindsight to make the decision on what the best game I ever played was at the time. For those 5 years between Ocarina of Time and Shadow of the Colossus, no video game truly spoke to me enough to usurp Link's great adventure through time. Of course, I liked minigames more, but if at any point you asked me what game was the best, it was always Ocarina of Time. In this section, we're going to turn back time and consider why Shadow of the Colossus ousted Zelda and ushered in a new era of my relationship to games. The first thing that drew me to the game was how small the protagonists seemed in comparison to their foes. Shadow of the Colossus' central premise is that you, a little bug compared to these majestic behemoths, could take them down. It's a premise with immense metaphorical potential and something I hadn't done before. Just viewing the game's promotional materials, the idea that I could be so small and take on my problems was naturally compelling to me. Sure, I'd fought some big baddies in my time, Goma in Ocarina of Time, or the ogres in Resident Evil 4, but practically never before were they so titanic that I'd have to climb them like a Mario 64 level. Fortunately, I got that PlayStation 2 to play Kingdom Hearts 2 and Katamari Damacy, so by the time I heard about Shadow of the Colossus, I was totally ready to slay some skyscrapers. You may be wondering, wait, Kingdom Hearts 2 came out after Shadow of the Colossus. And you're right. I didn't pay attention to PlayStation games before Kingdom Hearts 2, so I played Shadow of the Colossus the spring before my freshman year of high school, which was like 6 months after the game's release. So it wasn't right when it released in the fall. So sorry, everybody. I let you down. Regardless, the huge sizes of the Colossi were what drew me to considering purchasing the game. That said, I wouldn't have bought the game solely for its art style and cool premise. What fully sold me was some online articles I read about the game. While I had always been invested in gaming magazines, once I had internet access, I was drowning in gaming discourse across the web in 2005, and other folks helped sell me on Shadow of the Colossus. I fell in love with the fact that the game had what I considered no fluff. No dirtling enemies for you to slay on the way to the boss. Encounters which, to me, felt pointless and overlong. I grew to hate hordes of mindless enemies with no personality off the back of the Dynasty Warrior franchise. What friends I did play games with around this time all liked Dynasty Warriors. We would often kick off a weekend of gaming with mindless multiplayer where we slayed endless hordes of minions in endless succession. I hated it. So before I ever played it, Shadow of the Colossus was already the anti-Dynasty Warriors game in my mind. It was a game where every action seemed consequential and important, and I wanted to live a life where my actions felt consequential and important. Like many people, my 14th and 15th years of life were some of the most pivotal in my development as a person. When I turned 14, I was in 8th grade. While I had some friends, I was a loner. I had a room to myself, I had a computer connected to the internet in that room, as well as a television, a GameCube, an Xbox, and a PlayStation 2. I accrued most of these possessions by working for my mom, who had an internet business selling Renaissance dresses. For some kids, it might have seemed like I was living the life, and I was certainly fortunate to have all these different game consoles, a television, and a computer. I think that's pretty unique for 2005. But still, I spent most of my time alone, primarily playing games, reading manga, and watching Adult Swim. In 8th grade, I even downloaded Flash and made animations that I posted on Newgrounds.com. I'm slightly ashamed to admit that those animations, lip-syncing Naruto-inspired ripoffs of another animator, have more views than most of my YouTube videos. They're terrible. Please do not try to find them. But to be honest, at that time, I was no one. I had no personality, I had few redeemable traits. Even at the time, I hated myself. And I wished I was dead. I subscribed to the belief that my birth, the result of a teenage pregnancy, was a mistake, and I would never be anything more than that. 2 years later, when I turned 16, I would be on the road to long-term satisfaction, being able to accept and love myself. I wasn't yet thriving, but I was taking the appropriate steps to have the joyful life I now have. The change wasn't because of Shadow of the Colossus, but I did play Shadow of the Colossus within that 2-year window, and it did have a huge impact on me as a person. 2 years prior to Shadow of the Colossus's release, when I was in the 6th grade, I spent time after school at the library playing Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh! There, I made friends with a group of close-knit 8th graders. For the first time in my life, I had what I felt were real friends. Every weekend or every other weekend, I would spend time at the house of Alex, the son of a local dentist. Reminder, dentists are rich. Alex's basement was a veritable treasure trove of potential fun. It contained an indoor pool and a hot tub, a giant big screen television, a smaller television, which was always the one we played Melee on, I don't know why. And we always had so much pizza and video games. I don't know why, but Alex insisted on cutting the pizza into like watermelon shapes. I don't know. I don't get it. Maybe it's a dentist thing. I've never tried to do that on my own. Like me, these slightly older children were also Nintendo babies. So we primarily played Super Smash Bros. Melee, Mario Kart Double Dash, and Kirby Air Ride. A lot of Kirby Air Ride for some reason. Regardless of my feelings on that game, hanging out with this group of friends was the first time this young girl felt like she was a meaningful part of a group. Like I was wanted. From them, I realized what I was missing. To feel like a whole person, I needed to be in relationship with others, to exist beyond myself. Unfortunately, right as I realized this, a natural and unnatural barrier stunted my emotional development. The natural barrier was quite obvious, our age difference. I was a 6th grader, a mere 11 or 12-year-old. They were 8th graders, 13 or 14, and about to start high school. Alex was even heading off to boarding school. I worried I would never see him again. My fears were mostly validated. I would only remain friends with one person from that group after 6th grade, John. Throughout my middle school years, we both played World of Warcraft. We were friends then throughout high school until he graduated and left our small town. My date and I actually went to the Sadie Hawkins dance with him and his date my sophomore year. And then we went to his date's house and watched Doctor Who. This was right when the BBC revived it. So we watched the whole first season and it was rad. Honestly, I don't remember anything from the dance. I just remember watching Doctor Who. I want so badly to talk to him again. Though I don't know how. It's been over a decade. I don't even know how to contact him. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here in this distant past, prior to Shadow of the Colossus' release, to talk about the unnatural barrier that broke me and my development. Late in my 6th grade year, Alex, the dentist's son, invited me to volunteer at some Catholic church's strange holiday festival. None of our other friends showed up. It was just me, him, and some other boy. The other boy was much more crude than the rest of our friend group, a kind of edgy, early teenager. After the festival, the three of us went back to Alex's house. We ate watermelon pizza and we played games as usual. Eventually, we decided to go for a swim. While playing in the pool, the edgy teenager received a twisted idea from the back of his mind. He put a bucket on my head, and him and Alex took turns hitting it with their fists and then other improvised weapons near the poolside. I froze. Water splashed in the bucket into my nose, into my mouth. Ever since I was 6 or 7, I've had this nervous tic where I laugh whenever someone tries to beat me up or assault me. And I got beat up quite a few times growing up. It always pissed bullies off. So in the pool, with the bucket on my head, I was laughing, crying, and coughing up pool water at the same time as they hit me. Perhaps the laughing made them think I was enjoying it. I didn't. I felt violated. I felt so alone. I spent the night at Alex's house, and I remember silently crying myself to sleep. And that was the last time I stayed over. For years after that, I really couldn't trust anyone. While I had relationships and friendships, my view of myself grew small. I didn't want to be connected to anyone else. I didn't want to exist beyond myself. I wanted to be small, unimportant, like a mouse in a wall. And that's how I lived my life. By the time I played Shadow of the Colossus, I was that person. And that person resonated with the game's thematic material. I felt like a small person. And this was a game where you played a little bug. I felt like my problems were huge and overwhelming. And here was a game where you fought giant, seemingly insurmountable problems. I felt utterly alone. And this was a game where, outside your horse companion, you had no one to talk to. I guess you do talk to Dorman a little bit, but he doesn't count. Or they don't count. I felt like I didn't have an identity. And this guy was similarly identityless. I mean, his name was Wander. So before I ever stepped foot in these strange forgotten lands where a weirdo god commands you to kill all the creatures your shining sword can find, I felt a strange and full connection to Shadow of the Colossus as a game which projected some sense of my experience of the world back at me. Then I played it. And oh boy, Shadow of the Colossus is one heck of a game, isn't it? It's funny that Fumito Ueda said he was inspired by Zelda and that each Colossus was an inverted Zelda dungeon because, in my opinion, he cruised way past Zelda and created something distinct from its influences. Like Zelda, Shadow of the Colossus is a game where you play a sword-wielding hero on a quest to save a fair maiden, though Zelda is a prisoner in most Zelda games, and Mono, the girl in the game, is just straight up dead at the start of Shadow of the Colossus. Moreover, in Zelda games, you fight against a big bad evil, usually Ganon, whereas in Shadow of the Colossus, it's pretty clear you've chosen to be the lackey of the in-universe Ganon alternative, the god Dorman, who was presumably sealed away by a real hero eons ago. So, just to put the plot into perspective, Shadow of the Colossus retains some of its Zelda structure, but subverts it. Not in the shallow 2010s, oh wow, that subverted my expectations and didn't make any sense media, like, I don't know, Game of Thrones, but in the sense that it reimagines the hero's quest as a complicated endeavor. Wander's goals are noble and good, but his means are underhanded and dangerous. Thus, his quest and its accompanying gameplay are more nuanced and deceitful than the more plainly straightforward Zelda formula. I know that's mostly narrative description gobbledygook, but I bring it up because it clearly influences both how Shadow of the Colossus was designed and how we're meant to experience it. Zelda games are honestly designed. They want to lead you to their solution intuitively, but they're not afraid also to just spell it out for you in words. If you've ever played a Zelda game, you probably get what I mean. Once you've gone through 1 or 2 dungeons, the formula of the dungeon and what it's trying to do become so obvious, nothing can surprise you again. You're able to predict what item you'll get in each dungeon before the dungeon gives it to you because things like a hookshot ledge or something you need to shoot with a bow and arrow are just apparent to you. Similarly, moving through any given dungeon is easy. Just go to the rooms that you haven't gone to yet. When I was a child, I was an idiot, and Zelda's honest design challenged me all the same. But I haven't found the Zelda game difficult or challenging in decades. I don't mean that as an insult either. It's okay for games to not be difficult, but Zelda games are designed from the ground up to be as accessible as possible. In many respects, their accessible design makes them popular, and they're amazing entry points for people who haven't played games before. But by the time I was turning 15 years old, I may have still been a child on paper, but in the realm of video games, where I had been playing these things since I was 5 years old, I was a veteran, or at least I felt like one. I wanted to play games that made me think and do a little more than my prior favorites let on. The games I played at the time offered me nuggets of this potential, but they always filtered it through the complexity of other people or otherwise kind of crummy design. I loved competitive online matchmaking from Halo 2 when I had Xbox Live, but that was primarily because human opponents were unpredictable. It wasn't necessarily the game's design challenging me. Similarly, I liked World of Warcraft, but primarily because it was like a place to hang out. I thought all the grinding of quests and minions to get gold and mounts was needless busy work. I knew games could offer more than just casting the same 3 Shadow Priest spells again and again. Probably the closest I got to games whose design amazed me was Katamari Damacy and Resident Evil 4, though neither quite carried the spirit of Zelda, which is okay. Not every game has to be Zelda. Shadow of the Colossus, though, carried that spirit and moved it into a new age. While especially playing through it for the first time in over a decade, I can say that none of its fights are particularly difficult, and the game does just throw a hint system at you whenever it thinks you're stuck, which dilutes the mysterious power of its encounters. The encounters themselves are always meant to be a surprise and challenge your assumptions. You never encounter the same Colossus twice, and the means by which you defeat them are always changing. Shadow of the Colossus doesn't have a Na'vi telling you what to do, and the bosses don't always telegraph how to defeat them. While they literally have glowing weak points, the problem is never finding the weak points themselves, it's figuring out how to get on them in the first place. For instance, the boss fight that convinced me all the way back then that Shadow of the Colossus was the best game I ever played up until that point was the third one, known as Knight or Gaius. The Knight is a relatively simple encounter, but it's still one that rewards the player for their intuition. At first, considering the context of the first boss, another bipedal giant against whom you go straight for the Achilles, it made sense for me to gun for the guy's legs. But when I got there, I found he had little stone stubs for feet, nothing for me to stab. Running around a bit more, I had the idea in my head to run up his sword when he swung it on the ground, which made me feel like a genius. But then, another difficulty. I had nowhere to climb because his elbow had like a ring guard. After some trial and error, I got him to destroy his own elbow ring for me. Probably by accident. I don't think I did it on purpose. Then I climbed up him and I stabbed him in his weak spots until he was dead. What makes this boss stand out to me now is how little I felt guided through it. While none of the colossi are overly complex, my time playing Shadow of the Colossus was always complicated and messy. In any given fight, I spent more time running around like a chicken with my head cut off, while desperately shooting arrows and trying these dumb brain strategies to climb my foes. I would examine the beasts for weaknesses while trying to not be killed by their massive attacks, and the whole time, my heart pounded. When I made progress, my hands would sweat because progress meant I had more to lose if I messed up. Getting knocked off these colossi's back, a regular occurrence for me, was somehow both demoralizing and motivating as I scrambled to get back to where I was. Every encounter with a giant was a draining and meaningful experience. where I truly felt accomplished for defeating them. That sense of achievement, of victory, which accompanied felling the beasts, propelled me through the game. I was perpetually excited to see what the next fight held, and at no point did the game underwhelm me with what it had in store. Shadow of the Colossus succeeds because it balances a sense of wonder and intrigue through its barren and bizarrely constructed world with a strong sense of direction and purpose generated by the girl you're looking to save and the obvious solution to saving her, i.e., kill all these big dudes wandering the landscape. It taught me that a game can be good for reasons beyond having endless things to do like World of Warcraft, having big explosions and fast-paced gameplay like Halo 2, or being a dynamic and complicated adventure like Wind Waker with a lot of moving systems and mechanics. Shadow of the Colossus is, well, a simple game. It's relatively short, it lacks much inbuilt replay value, it doesn't push new game mechanics or even new gameplay ideas to the forefront. It's just a game with 16 puzzle bosses and some long horse rides to get there. To describe Shadow of the Colossus plainly is to sell it short though, because what made the game meaningful to me as a 15-year-old was not what initially drew me to it. It wasn't the fact that it eschewed Dynasty Warriors' trite combat system or you fought big giants in a game with wonderfully unique art direction. That's why I threw $50 down for a copy. But it stayed with me because of how it made me feel. So many designers construct their games around the player's mind. By that, I mean they imagine what the player might be thinking and try to design themselves out of any problems that might obstruct the player's thought process. Valve's design is famous for their ability to predict the player's reaction to the game world and tutor them toward making the right decisions without explicitly telling them what those decisions are. The vast majority of the industry, if I'm being honest, desperately want to avoid you ever feeling stuck. They don't want you to feel lost, like you don't know what to do next. When a channel like Game Maker's Toolkit or anyone else explores the nuance of good game design, what they really mean is games which teach you how to play them well so they don't frustrate you. From a capitalistic perspective, this is a great idea because a frustrated player is one more likely to reject your game, potentially return it, or not buy your next one. We've been designing games for 5 decades now, and for the most part, we've figured out what works and have cultivated a ludic language most games players speak or are able to play, like how all first-person shooters have virtually the same control scheme. But that unified language and design philosophy comes at a cost. Unified design goals flatten the emotional potential of game mechanics, as they're designed first to be accessible and second to be anything else. And note, I'm using the term accessible there not to mean like the way we talk about it when we talk about game accessibility, like you got options for playing the game in different ways that help different people with different disabilities, etc., able to play the game. I'm talking about accessibility and how the game teaches you how to play it and how it conforms to the design principles of other games in order to kind of give the player a shorthand. In essence, I'm complaining about the shorthand, not literally like accessibility features in a game. I hope that that distinction is clear. I had to do that all ad hoc. That's not written down in the script. But I hope that makes sense to you. Anyways, Shadow of the Colossus is not that game. In my honest opinion, by the standards of its time and ours, it's designed poorly. Outside of slightly increased health and stamina bars, you gain no new abilities across the game's duration. So long, power fantasy. The game never meaningfully teaches you its mechanics. It's frequently frustrating and annoying when you can't figure out how to progress a boss fight, and Dorman's cryptic advice is barely useful. I remember when I first played the game, I didn't even know there was a bow. I had to accidentally figure that one out. It's a game meant to get you stuck once in a while. Yet, the frustration is the point. Shadow of the Colossus is not designed for your brain. It's not designed with all sorts of bits and bobbles to lead you to a satisfactory outcome, because this is not a victory lap. This is a tragedy. Not only should you feel frustrated by the game's bosses, you should feel a solemn sense of loss when you fell them, because the truth is, each time you kill a Colossus, you commit a grave sin. Shadow of the Colossus is a game designed to make you feel proud of yourself for figuring out how to do evil deeds. And with each Colossus corpse in your wake, your pale avatar grows darker and more worn down. If your modern AAA game is designed to appease your mind, Shadow of the Colossus is designed from the ground up to appease your heart, to be emotionally evocative first, and teach you fundamental truths about yourself and the world through its gameplay. After that, we can worry about good game design. So, when I finished Shadow of the Colossus, became a Colossus myself, and then died and rebirthed as a mere baby, I too died and was reborn. I stopped seeing games as I once did as interesting ways to kill time, as things I'm primarily meant to just be good at. I started to see them as art, as a piece of media which could make me feel profound and meaningful emotions. From that point onward, a good game wasn't one I had fun with, wasn't one with excellent mechanics, wasn't one which shocked me or created a new line of discourse. No, a good game was one which produced in me powerful emotions. One which made me think and occasionally left me dismayed. I've always been bothered by what we think of as good game stories, because so often the quality of a good game story are really just the qualities of like a good movie story. We want good vocal and motion capture performances, powerful cutscenes, intriguing narratives, and memorable characters. And I'm not saying any of those things are bad, but to me, a good game story is the one that you tell yourself. It's one based not on the events of fictional characters within your playground, but what you experienced in that playground, what you felt, and why you felt it. While Shadow of the Colossus isn't the first game that made me feel things, it's the game that made me realize that the powerful emotions a game could draw from me was what made a game good or bad. I still like a well-designed game, don't get me wrong, but my highest praise is not for games which reach the goals of a game design class, but the ones which, like great poetry, carry an emotional resonance which resounds across the rest of my life, which resounds in my soul. Shadow of the Colossus echoes in such a manner. Halfway through my freshman year of high school, we lost our house. In the dead of winter, we moved to my grandparents' cabin located an hour north of our hometown, with no internet, a shared TV with one station, burning wood in a fireplace to stay warm, no games console to comfort me, no privacy, and spending 2.5 hours each day driving to and from school. I went through a profound change. I stopped playing video games and I started listening to and playing music a lot more seriously. I started reading books. Between us losing our house and me moving off to college, the only new games I started were Super Smash Bros. Brawl and Wii Sports, which are just multiplayer games. I guess I was kind of good at Guitar Hero at parties. I skipped Twilight Princess and Super Mario Galaxy, potential heirs to the throne of greatest game I ever played at the time, considering my personal history. I missed out on BioShock, Mass Effect, and Fallout 3 at the time. I've replayed them now. I had no clue what was going on in the video game world for a good 3 to 4 years. While my relationship with my best friend and college roommate, different John, would bring me back into video games and eventually lead to what amounts to a PhD in video games, which is what I have now, I needed time away from them. While I changed in my hobbies quite profoundly during that time, it was my personality that most drastically altered. You'd have to imagine that being a hopeless teenager with no friends and then tragically losing my childhood home, that might leave me even more hopeless. But strangely, it broke me out of my shell. All of my old comforts lost to me, I started reaching out to others and forming real relationships again. I wasn't perfect. I was fickle and oversensitive, and especially in high school. I wasn't a good friend. You wouldn't have wanted to be friends with me in high school because I made mistakes. Yet, I meaningfully cut out my harmful thoughts, antisocial tendencies, and the prickly bits of my personality from myself. I still had a hard time trusting people, and would for the entirety of my high school career, but I let them in, and they let me in. It's funny, today I watch movies with my best friend from high school, Bridget. I've been in a band for a decade with friends I made during high school, and I've retained those relationships into college. I'm playing Baldur's Gate 3 right now with 3 people I've known for over a decade. And we meet weekly to play Magic the Gathering too. My joy isn't rooted in any single one of these relationships, but the durability of my friendships does point to how I changed at that time and how important the people who helped me change are to me. I keep changing. Heck, I came out as trans. But they keep me around and I keep them around because I love them and they love me. It would be folly to suggest Shadow of the Colossus caused a sea change in my life, but it did mark it. Shadow of the Colossus was a game which lied right on the precipice of a massive shift. It was the last great game I played before I put games away for a while, and in my heart, it stayed and solidified. I can recall in 2010 getting into a really heated argument that video games are art, despite not playing any for years. And while I can't remember if I distinctly mentioned Shadow of the Colossus, that was the game that convinced me of the truth. Shadow of the Colossus is both a reminder of who I was before I changed, and the potent symbol of the possibility of change, of our ability to slay our colossi, to become someone different than you were yesterday. You're capable of it too, just like I was. While Shadow of the Colossus is an emotional journey punctuated by desperate and shameful acts of murder, I realized that I wasn't killing my problems when I scaled these colossi like I thought. I was killing myself, or rather, parts of myself that inhibited growth. I'm glad I pruned myself, and I hope I never stop pruning. Fumito Ueda is the ambassador for game design by subtraction, and Shadow of the Colossus was the best game I ever played when I was 15 because it taught me that becoming better isn't just about adding new things to yourself. It's just as often about looking inwards, identifying what's inhibiting your growth, and cutting those parts of yourself off. And I love that. I think that's really valuable. On March 23, 2007, the film Reign Over Me released in American theaters. Starring Adam Sandler in a comedian to dramatic role career shift and Don Cheadle just doing his thing, Reign Over Me concerns 2 men. One, Alan, is a successful dentist who, despite having it all, has no hobbies or friends and feels dissatisfied with his life. The other, Charlie, is a victim of terrible tragedy. 4 years removed from losing his wife and 3 daughters in the 9/11 terrorist attacks. He is disheveled and wanders the streets of New York on a motorized scooter, far before such eyesores were littered on the sidewalks of every major city in America. Charlie and Alan were college roommates and reconnect through the random luck of urban happenstance. The pair's relationship is rocky. Charlie refuses to think about his personal pain or story, but his sudden violent outbursts and suspicious nature negatively affect his relationship with everyone around him. By the end of the film, and through a series of quite dramatic events, Charlie and Alan are finally able to recognize their personal problems and take steps to fix themselves. A year after its theatrical release and almost 5 years before they would revolutionize the media industry with a streaming service, Netflix sent me a DVD copy of Reign Over Me in the mail. I rented it purely because I read online that the video game Shadow of the Colossus played a prominent role in the plot of the film. That impression was a lie. Shadow of the Colossus plays no role in the plot of Reign Over Me, though it is a powerful metaphor the film constantly references. Charlie is obsessed with the game and won't stop playing it. The subtext isn't too hard to spot. Through Shadow of the Colossus, a game about slaying skyscraper-sized giants, Charlie relives the traumatic events of the Twin Towers falling, but this time ostensibly under his own control. the audience is never privy to a flashback which might directly evoke the attacks, but they see Colossi fall in a montage mid-film, which helps make the connection to the attacks in their minds. After watching Reign Over Me though, you can't quite return to Shadow of the Colossus in the same way you once did, because suddenly it becomes a metaphor for 9/11. Shadow of the Colossus has an incredibly strange relationships with the terrorist attacks though, because on one hand, it's you who causes the metaphor to happen, and on the other hand, whenever a Colossus is slain, you bear the brunt of its punishment as you absorb the creature's soul or some remnant of its being into yourself and pointedly suffer for the action. By the end of the game, the weight of the tragedy weighs so heavy upon you that you become a shadow creature enacting violence on those who would only wish to stop your reign of terror. So, wow, it isn't too difficult to reach out of the Colossus as a metaphor for US imperialism, is it? The thing is, the Colossi don't just have to represent world politics, because Shadow of the Colossus is a game of endless metaphors. When we examine it closely, we find a surprising looseness with which it plays with its plot and details. While we can dig into the lore and get a general impression of what exactly is going on here, the solo player lacks any context for the actions of the game. You may find an ambiguous plot with little direction and a vague narrative without purpose a fatal flaw from the standards of traditional storytelling. Particularly of the Hollywood variety, Shadow of the Colossus is a total failure. Yet, when we experience the game, the slipperiness of the specifics allows the protagonist and his colossal foes to stand in for whatever the player wants. For a depressed person, a Colossus could be their mountain of self-doubt and sadness, and slaying it could be overcoming their mental woes. For someone who hates their boss, a towering turtle could represent their labor and give them an outlet for their frustration with their work life. For a girl going through a breakup, scaling a building-sized baddie and stabbing him in the head can serve as a soothing remedy to heartache. Or maybe, if you're completely against the idea of symbolism, you can just paraphrase Sigmund Freud. Sometimes a Colossus is just a Colossus. You know, it's not just me. It seems everybody has a different interpretation of Shadow of the Colossus. Lewis Gordon of NPR claims the game is about lost connection and loneliness and draws a connection to the COVID pandemic, arguing these games are even more poignant, virtual expressions of a loneliness which grips many lives in the modern world. Graham Day of The Escapist argues Shadow of the Colossus is a parable for grief, which mirrors the famous stages of the grieving process and teaches us grief is something we have to move through. Writing for Collider, Benny Ragalbuto, I'm not going to do the names well. Benny Ragalbuto explains that Shadow of the Colossus is really all about consequences. It's a cautionary tale about taking actions without thinking them through. Ari Saborn makes the same point about consequences, but twists it a little to emphasize that it's actually about the problem of good intentions. Writing for Variety magazine, Gerard Howard III puts forth the idea that Shadow of the Colossus is about the Japanese concept of ma, or emptiness, which is emphasized by how barren the game's world is. Howard wants us to know that the game's purpose is to give us a moment to step back and breathe, because Shadow of the Colossus is, quote, not simply a game, but a state of mind. Jordan Magnuson of Necessary Games, meanwhile, describes Shadow of the Colossus as a poem, perhaps like Beowulf, one you write as you play. Leadhead's video, The Beautiful Mysteries of Shadow of the Colossus, focuses on how mysterious the game is and how it pushes you to lean into the unknown, to love the mystery rather than seek the answers. Dan Olson of Folding Ideas tells us the game is an ambiguous morality tale, which both places us in the shoes of a tragic character and humanizes his foes, where ultimately,
the ultimate judgment of Wander is left to you, the observer, to decide based on your own values.
So, what is it? What is Shadow of the Colossus about? Well, don't go asking Fumito Ueda because he doesn't care or would prefer you made it up yourself anyways. According to one interview, he believes clinging onto a theme is far too inefficient when making a video game. He's stated he's never felt motivated by the stories of video games and that he'd rather let the receivers make their own story from their imagination. So, no, despite what anyone else might tell you, Shadow of the Colossus is not deliberately a game about something. It's a game, ostensibly, about nothing, made by a guy who constantly disavows his game's stories, who says he doesn't pay attention to them when he plays other games, and who isn't particularly concerned about the details of his tales. Of course, we can read the game without Fumito Ueda's input, but as evidenced by the many different opinions on the game, which I just told you about, a little author's advice might have been useful for parsing the meaning of this messy and complicated and vague game. What's so interesting about Shadow of the Colossus is that it's simultaneously a game about nothing and one about everything. Perhaps most stories we encounter are like a finely polished and cut gem, a thing once raw, but crafted with deliberate purpose and shape, meant to be looked at in a particular way. Meanwhile, Shadow of the Colossus is crude ore. We're free to ignore it, or if we desire, we're free to shape and cut it ourselves. We can connect it to our past selves, help us tell a story about ourselves. It can give us a new sense of life and death following a traumatic experience, as we'll come to see in the next section. It can be a potent morality tale or teach us about Ma, that all-important emptiness which carries its own significance. So I suppose part of the answer is that Shadow of the Colossus can be whatever you want it to be. But that's not too satisfying of an answer. You can actually replace the word Shadow of the Colossus in that sentence for pretty much any story. Sure, Hamlet can be whatever you want it to be, or maybe Terminator 2 can be whatever you want it to be. But really, they aren't, are they? With most pieces of media, with most stories, we allow them to touch us as a body of people. When we give a film an Oscar or a game one of those Gamey Awards Jeff Keighley's always handing out, we acknowledge a shared connection to a work. We form fandoms around media to appreciate it together. We hold conventions in that media's honor. We gladly buy into media-inspired togetherness, which deepens and expands our connection both to the art itself and to other people. How many thousands of people have found a romantic partner through a shared connection to a piece of art? How many have found a lifelong friend in the same way? It doesn't even have to be localized to a particular TV show or game either. Fandom extends to things like sports or political parties, where we celebrate with fellow fans our victories and suffer together our dismal losses. As a fan of the Detroit Lions, let's just say anyone who likes this team enjoys our collective suffering and identifies with it in a way we do more than our victories. But being losers gives us an identity, one we accept, one we embrace. While we can interpret most pieces of art in any way, for the most part, it's a lot like sports fandom. The collective group of folks in community, because of the art itself, tend to agree more than they disagree on what it's all about. Shadow of the Colossus is strange because pretty much everyone who has played it shares a connection to the game, as in we all seem to like it, but we don't share a belief on what that connection means. Think of it a little like this. A film like Barbie both connects us to itself and to other people who watched it with us, which helped create that cultural moment around the movie this summer. Shadow of the Colossus, meanwhile, hoards us, refuses to give us an easy way to associate with another person on the basis of our shared playtime with the game. Shadow of the Colossus is too singular an experience. When you play Shadow of the Colossus, You play your version of it. The game itself isn't personalized to you. This isn't a Super Mario 64 conspiracy theory video, but rather, no two people experience the same Shadow of the Colossus. The game asks too much of you. You must fill in its many blanks, fork over your own emotions to it. It doesn't spell out how you should feel about the game. Does defeating a Colossus fill you with joy, or perhaps sadness, or perhaps bitterness, or perhaps accomplishment, perhaps something else? If only it were so simple, because you probably get a mix of all four, plus a whole lot of other emotions on the emotion wheel every time you down one of these behemoths. Your mix of emotions probably isn't going to easily map onto someone else's mix of emotions, which makes your experience unique to you. In many ways, Shadow of the Colossus is a game for the modern age. Not so long ago, all mass media was communally oriented. If you listened to music 75 years ago, you probably did so at a bar or at a concert hall. And guess what? You were surrounded by other people. You listened as a group. The music was not for a singular you, it was for a plural you. If you go to a movie in the theater, not only was it mass produced to be seen all over the country simultaneously, but you sat in a theater together. You laughed together at a comedy. You screamed together at some horror. Even television, the first barrage of singular focused media, was for a plural audience. The Kennedy assassination was an important event in American history, not just because our leader was killed, but because everyone experienced it together over the airwaves. Today, while media is perhaps more mass than ever, we don't experience it often as an us. We experience it as an I. You're most likely watching this video alone. I'm only talking to you here. When you scroll TikTok, an algorithm dictated by your previous choices makes video recommendations for your eyes only. Television and movies are experienced by ourselves in our homes, far from everyone else. You can have communities around these things. Don't think I'm saying the plural you is gone. It's just the individual you as a consumer of art is far more prevalent than at any time in the past. It's getting more difficult to not feel like the art we experience hasn't been curated specifically for us. Shadow of the Colossus, more than most games, seems to be made for that audience, for the new us that exists post the game's release. Games themselves are often a medium designed for a singular you. Of course, a plural audience is baked into the DNA of games. I mean, Pong is a multiplayer game, and when we compete for high scores in Pac-Man, we do so against another human being. And a lot of the most popular games like Counter-Strike, League of Legends, etc. are for many different people to experience at once, but we've got a lot of games fenced off in their own little corner, and we feel free to call them single-player games. Yet, even amongst the singular rabble, Shadow of the Colossus stands out, doesn't it? It never had a cultural moment or ad campaign we collectively remember. It doesn't stick out in the minds of impressionable children and become nostalgia fuel like Mario, Zelda, or Gex. If you clicked on this video and made it this far, you either like me, which, hey, thanks, or you've played Shadow of the Colossus, and I bet your experience of the game was rather singular. When you played it, why you played it, and what it meant to you are all localized to you. Compare this with, say, Skyrim. I was just talking to a friend who vividly remembers 11/11/11, the game's release date, and how excited he and everyone were for the game. People quoted a Dumguard's injury history for months and years post-release. Everyone had an opinion on it, and they had those opinions and thoughts at the same time. Skyrim, for all intents and purposes, had a distinct cultural moment. You didn't experience it alone. The other two games we covered this season, Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time, also had cultural moments. They stick with us not just because they're fun games we played one time, but because we were invested with others. We talked about these games with friends. We speedran them in globally popular competitions, compared them to each other, compared them to each subsequent release in their franchises. I'm sure I belabored this point enough, But when you enjoy a game, film, or television series, you do not do it alone most of the time. You do it in a shared context. That context is just as important to understanding how you feel about that game and why as the actual content of the game. Shadow of the Colossus, meanwhile, has none of that baggage, and as a result, it exists for you, for me, alone. It's a lonely game of endless metaphors. It doesn't know you as a member of a crowd. It knows you as you. It speaks to some primordial strength within the ludic and thematic content of Shadow of the Colossus that we remember and memorialize it the way we do. This summer, I read the book Underland by Robert Macfarlane. The book is all about underground places like catacombs, caves, and sewers. In one chapter, he visits Kolhelleran, or the Hole of Hell in Norway. This sea cave is particularly difficult to reach, but was used as a communal hub many thousands of years ago. The cave's walls are decorated with paintings surviving well beyond their artists. The paintings Macfarlane focuses on are a series of red stick figures dancing together, presumably for the rest of time. Like us playing Shadow of the Colossus, Macfarlane made the treacherous journey to see these figures alone. His reaction to the red dancers has stuck with me since I read it. These figures are ghosts, all dancing together, and I am a ghost too. And there's a conviviality to them, to us, to the thousands of years for which they have been dancing here together. Suddenly, unexpectedly, my head begins to tingle and my back and chest start to shake, and I find myself crying, sobs shuddering my body in the teardrop-shaped rift, far from another human and so close to these generous figures. The dangers of the journey to reach the dancers ebb from me, and the joy of their movement ebbs into me, and I cry there, surprised and helpless, deep and granted in darkness, weeping for feelings I cannot name. I don't know what the red dancers would mean to me if I ever encountered them, but it probably wouldn't be the same. Yours probably wouldn't either. They too are images of endless metaphors and possibilities made by a group of people but now experienced alone, a singular you taking in and translating their beauty by yourself. So of course, I can't help but feel Shadow of the Colossus is video gaming's equivalent to the Red Dancers. Its power has a nameless and deep energy. It's art without need for context, or perhaps even better, context deters its strength. I'm glad I played Shadow of the Colossus alone, because it allowed me to take from it what I needed 15 years ago, as it allowed me to find something beautiful about myself. A month ago, when I played Shadow of the Colossus for the second time, I didn't quite know where I wanted to go with it. I didn't know what it meant to me today. Fate, I suppose, has answered my ambiguity. One day after I finished Shadow of the Colossus, I almost died. Death, it seems, has a way of coaxing meaning out of you. So, it's finally time to tell you what Shadow of the Colossus means to me, and tell you about the time I almost died. On August 6th, 2023, I was struck by a reckless driver. They broke my fibula and clavicle, but worst of all, they broke my head. I have been told I was picked up by an ambulance shortly after being hit and brought to the emergency room. My wife, noticing I was gone for way too long, was terrified and went to the grocery store to try to find me. She initially worried that I was hate crimed. While searching, she received a call and was able to see me in the hospital. Evidently, I was conscious. I recognized her and was able to talk, though I had what she described as a goldfish brain. My mother drove 4 hours to see me as well. I had a general outline of where I was and why I was there, but it didn't seem to fully solidify. I wasn't lucid. In my fugue state, it seems we have a few patterns. I was evidently pretty nice to everyone. I would tell the nurses that I adored them and that they worked a noble and important profession. I would tell my mom I loved her and that she was a great mother. I would constantly ask about the person who hit me, worrying if they were okay. Not because, I don't know, I'm the Hulk and hitting me would hurt a car, but because I would feel a lot of guilt about hitting someone with my car. And finally, I would ask again and again where my child was and if I was holding them when I got hit. Fortunately, I was not. It's important to reiterate, though, that this has all been told to me. I do not remember any of it. Despite my many injuries, it seemed I was in good spirits that first day. I guess I wasn't as okay on the second day, where I was quite depressed. The doctors and nurses even got a trauma therapist to come talk to me. It's no surprise, I was in a lot of pain. I kept trying to pull off my neck brace. I was despondent and I would throw up every time I moved. So that wasn't good. At this point, I lied in a hospital bed for almost 48 hours with a broken shoulder and leg. I was unable to get up or do anything. I was sick and dizzy if I looked at any screens. I wasn't quite myself. Though again, I'm only telling you a story I've heard, not something I can say the person you're listening to experienced, because all of this is as foreign to me as it is to you. On Tuesday morning, August 8th at 3:30 a.m., I woke up, and for the first time, I was lucid. I had a vague idea of where I was and what happened to me, but I was still confused. I couldn't lift my left arm or even roll over. My neck was sore. I touched the back of my head and felt staples haphazardly inserted into me, dried blood and matted hair near the crown of my skull. It was dark, and I was alone. I was so alone. It's difficult to explain what it felt like, to be on the other end of a gap, of a profound emptiness between you and yourself. Though, I'm going to try. After talking with my nurse for a moment, I turned on the television. Something youthful stirred in me. It must have been years since I'd watched anything on cable television willingly, so I went to one of my old favorites, Cartoon Network. At that early hour, they were playing The Amazing World of Gumball, which is one of the most fever-dreamish television shows I've ever seen and wasn't aided by all of the weird drugs I was on, but hey, it wasn't bad. I messaged my wife on my phone. I looked through the many well wishes I'd gotten from friends and family. Turns out my dad, in telling my giant family's group chat I was gravely injured, awkwardly outed me to all of my aunts, uncles, sisters, and cousins by using both my dead name and my actual name and he, her pronouns to describe me. And note, that's like he, her. Like he, her is in the hospital. I don't know. My other family members were more accepting than he has been, which is fortunate. Even my landlord pitched in a message wishing well on me. You know, it feels odd to be defined by something that happened to you, but I'm glad people care about me. I took a picture of myself in my hospital attire and I posted it to Instagram with the title, "I lived," which felt appropriately life-affirming. A few hours after I woke up, my wife and mom joined me in the hospital. They weren't allowed to stay overnight. They helped explain to me the gap in my memory, who hit me, what the neurodoctors had to say about my head, and how my arm and leg were doing. Still, I wouldn't say they filled the gap in my memory or in my sense of personal continuity. They just gave me details about what a stranger had been up to the past few days, one whose body I just happen to inhabit now. On Tuesday and Wednesday, I started to show more constant improvement. I was able to go for short walks and get over to the bathroom with some help. While I threw up a few times from feeling constantly dizzy, including when I got my x-rays, the doctors felt I was good enough to go home. So that's what we did. But at home, all I could do was lay on the couch and watch a little TV. I couldn't hold my toddler, write videos, or do anything serious. I was still living a half-life, stretched thin and wearied by any activities. I couldn't stand for long. I was always nauseous. My body and soul ached as I tried to make sense of what happened. You want to know something funny though? I was roadkill on Sunday, August 6th, and for months I was scheduled to defend my dissertation on Monday, August 7th. My wife tried to get in contact with my advisor, but he didn't get the word. They met online to question me on the book-length project I devoted the past 2 years of my life to writing, and I didn't show up. Fortunately, through one of my close friends, they were able to learn that I was in the hospital, but boy, doesn't it suck to spend 5 years building to something, your PhD, only to be hit by a car the day before you're due to bring it over the finish line? Well, I was supposed to graduate in the summer, but the deadline was only like a week away, so 11 days after my accident, while I was still recovering at home, I defended my dissertation successfully, mind you, with some revisions that only took me a couple hours to wrap up. It's sad, but it's all tarnished. I worked so hard on this, and now every congratulatory message is accompanied with an additional note about how brave or strong I was, considering the circumstances of it all. Instead, and I don't mean to be a downer, but I don't feel accomplished. I finished defending my work, I felt kind of bad about it, and I went and took a nap. Now I'm a doctor, but I haven't celebrated. I haven't done anything to mark the fact that I spent 5 years getting this degree, earning this title. August was supposed to be the finale of an arduous journey I set out on long ago. Instead, it was nearly the finale of my life. So I guess that tends to paint the emotional color of the month a little differently. Somehow, in the middle of all of this was the video you're watching now. I'd wanted to start writing this video right after the Ocarina of Time review, which, by the way, was included on my dissertation. I'd always known the first 3 videos of this season, corresponding to the best game I ever played at ages 5, 10, and 15, were going to be Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, and Shadow of the Colossus. Unfortunately, my advisor had moved up my dissertation timeline about 6 months to May, as opposed to in the winter. And so it was due in July. So from May through July, I crunched hard on my dissertation, and I wrote about 150 pages, ignoring YouTube while I did. I was roaring and ready to go after finishing up the project, and right away when I got back from a quick week-long vacation, I got to work doing research and outlining this video. I finished my Shadow of the Colossus playthrough at 1:44 a.m. on August 5th. 36 hours later, I'd be in the hospital as Lettuce Doe. They didn't know my name, so they had to put me in as an anonymous person. I remember, around the time I woke up in the hospital, that this video was one of the things I was mad about. I was originally going to spend all of August writing, recording, and editing what you're watching, with a hopeful release at the end of the month, before the school semester started and I'd have a big teaching load, which would cut a lot into video editing time. So I don't know when you're going to get this, but it wasn't what I planned or when I planned it. And I felt guilty that someone hit me with a car and almost killed me because it messed up my video production schedule. So there I was. I sat in a hospital, then I sat at home, recovering from an awful trauma. My mind, though, mostly dwelled on death. In some ways, I've had a terribly unique traumatic experience. Most people who go through these events remember what happened to them. They store it in their memory. And perhaps those memories dictate their future actions, because when you have trauma, you tend to relive it. I've had some traumatic experiences, and I do remember them. And let's just say, they stick with me. This, though, it can't. I can't remember being hit by the car. I can't remember being in an ambulance as they cut off my clothes to treat me. I can't remember being in the emergency room. I can't remember the agonizing pain of the first 2 days after the accident. So I don't know what to do with all of this. The physical trauma of the accident left its scars on my body, but instead of also leaving mental scars corresponding to them, it gave me emptiness. It gave me, well, I don't mean to be crude, but it gave me a sense of death. Well, for those 2 days, I was alive, talking even. Other people can attest that they experienced me, but I did not experience myself. So now, as I reflect on what happened, I don't dwell on accidents or cars or hospitals, maybe a little. Instead, I'm stuck on a gap. A 2-day gap where I, at least as I know me, did not exist. It terrifies me. I've got a few hazy memories from the Saturday and Sunday before the accident, but the last real important thing I recall is finishing Shadow of the Colossus. Shadow of the Colossus has a particularly memorable ending, but to be honest, I couldn't have told you much about it from memory before I finished the second playthrough. Throughout the game, every time Wander kills a Colossus, he grows more poisoned, his body taking on a ghostly appearance. After he finishes the last of his foes, he returns to the temple, injured and weak, but ready to see his beloved revived. Unfortunately, the priest and his lackeys also make it to the party, and they attack Wander, stab him with a blade. Then, like the Colossus once so foreign to him, his injury spews forth misty black blood, because he has become one of them. He gets up and lurches towards Mono, pulling out the blade, but it's too late. The darkness of Dorman, the god he's unleashed, consumes his body. After a brief moment of peace, Wander's body transforms into the avatar of a god. Dorman angrily addresses the priest, admonishes them for severing their body, and claims to be risen anew. In the game's strangest sequence, we take control of Dorman's possession of Wander's body. In essence, we become a Colossus. We attack and kill the men who killed Wander, but it's not enough. They escape and through some ritual create a force powerful enough to reseal the god. The darkness consuming Wander's body is sucked away into the light and only Wander is left. But try as we might, and yes, we are in control here, we can't resist it and are pulled into the pool like the god. Mono wakes up. Our horse returns to the temple, and together they find Wander reborn as a baby with horns. The trio climb to a sanctuary as life returns to the Forgotten Lands. As I lied in that hospital and thought about the ending, I couldn't help but feel connected to Wander and Dorman's final moments. Wander spent his last actions killing Colossi, these walking skyscrapers, most of which have the personality and disposition of beasts. Compared to us, the player, to a human, they're striking and majestic, sure, but their size betrays a vapid sense of nothingness behind their eyes. They're hollow husks, neither alive or dead. In the end, Wander becomes, or always was, an animal just like them. I can't help but feel like in my missing 2 days, that was me. I was a shadowy creature on the precipice of death, pulled back to life by the kind expertise of strangers. It wasn't me who accepted their treatment and love. It was that thing I'd been reduced to in the meantime. And like Wander, I was resurrected, reborn. I came back, but not without a cost. The gap of memory and self-awareness, which continues to haunt me. You know, one of the things that you have to be aware of, that I've always tried to be aware of, is that you're the center of every experience you'll ever have. When you reckon with that, you can start to step outside of yourself a bit, understand that others see things differently than you and learn from them. But in my 2 days of suffering, I can honestly say I, the person talking to you, was not at the center of every experience I had. I wasn't there, at least not in the way I'm here now. I wasn't somewhere else either, off on vacation or at the beach. I was nowhere. I was no one. I think I have a tendency to forget my body. If you can't tell by the dozens of hours of videos I put out and hundreds of thousands of words I've committed to print and sound, I tend to mostly exist up here. My world is dictated by the thoughts I have, ideas I encounter, words I hear, and sentences I speak. That's what feels most real to me. But I'm reminded now that I'm a body that can exist without me, and one day won't exist at all. I've always known that, of course. How could I not? But feeling my body crack and crumble, having my brain bleed, and my memories flow out from me, all because of a stranger's reckless mistake, makes me feel more fragile and real. It makes me scared. Someday I won't have the luxury of being an animal. I'll just be a corpse, and everything I've ever thought or felt will be gone. In a strange and mysterious encounter, I got to feel what it was like to not experience myself, to know what it'd be like to be gone, and well, I don't know how to feel about it, but I know I'm feeling a lot. Earlier this summer, before accidents and dissertation, ants infested our apartment. I was hanging out with my toddler when they saw one, and I squished it. Then a second later, its comrade came up right behind, and being the little imitator that they are, my child went to step on them. I knew immediately that I'd made a mistake. From that moment on, whenever I saw an ant, I'd pick it up, let it crawl on me or on a piece of paper, and deposit it outside our apartment. Of course, as expected, the ants just kept coming, but when I looked at them, I couldn't help but feel a sense of connection. Carl Sagan describes us as the universe experiencing itself, and I couldn't bring myself to rob another creature of that experience. So, I stopped killing bugs, much to my wife's annoyance, as fruit flies also invaded our home around that time. I stopped eating meat because touching it made me think about the animal who died for my sustenance. I would wonder, what did this cow or chicken or pig see? It's all stupid, I know. I've been a pacifist for years, over a decade, but probably from the stress of the dissertation, I really took it to another level. I don't know how long I will keep it up. My work desk is infested with ants, and they keep crawling on my arms while I'm typing, and I can only gently remove them, hoping not to cause any harm. I'm just too sensitive, I guess. I empathize too much with the experience of insects. Still, I can't help but feel that I'm one of them. If I just zoom out a little bit to the perspective of my apartment building or city, I'm just an ant, right? I'm just an animal like Wander, like Dorman. My internal anxieties, they just exist up here. They're just for me. Well, and I guess for you. Now that I'm on the other side of the gap, I look back on the myself that lived through those 2 days, and she feels like one of my ants wandering my desk. Someone that could, by the action of another creature, suddenly end. She's a stranger in close proximity, sharing some experience of the world, but not the same one. Still, she and I share something. We both got hit by a car. We were both loved by the same people who came together to help and keep this going. Even if it wasn't me who saw their faces, who spoke and listened to them, who cried and felt the early pains of a broken body, I'm still here. I'm still here. I don't know what I want you to take from this. Originally, part 4 of this video was supposed to be about what the heck we're supposed to do with Shadow of the Colossus in 2023 as a game, as art. I've told you some words, I've relayed my experience to you, but I don't know what it all means. Maybe, hopefully, it will mean something to you, and I hope, in the same way that Shadow of the Colossus is a game of endless metaphors, that you can take something personal for you, just you, from this story, from my story. What I do know is that I almost died, and Shadow of the Colossus gave me a better way to understand what happened to me. If a video game can do that, it's probably worth talking about for 2 hours. I love you. Thank you for watching. I'd like to thank my top patrons, also known as Goofs, Caddies, Enid the Game's Nihilist, Haneke, Kalis, Lamhoot, Lily Noah, Maximus, Playologist, Scott Edwards, Yamlet Herrera, and Thea Ware. You guys are great. Thank you.